Hey, look, Adam Smith is back. The first time I mentioned this book, this text, I probably understated its significance. This is one of the most important books ever written. It's up there with religious texts, Newton's scientific method, Darwin's Origin of the Species. It's of vital importance. There's a lot of stuff that comes out of it. For instance, this notion, particularly in countries like America or even Canada, where we say the market should decide, that government is inefficient, let the market decide. Competition is good, is healthy, etc., right? You might even have heard expressions like the invisible hand of the marketplace, or just the invisible hand, right? Or market forces. They come from this book originally, right? This is the foundation of classical economics, of economics as a subject area, right? So let's take an excerpt just to see how important it is to this unit, firm theory. Here we go. Take a look at this first paragraph. It is not from the benevolence, in other words, the kindness and generosity, of the butcher, the brewer, or the baker, from which we expect our dinner, in other words, our wealth and standard of living, but from their regard to their own well-being. Huh? Read the next part, right? It is as though, right, this he or she is led by an invisible hand to promote an end which was no part of his intention. What does that mean? Well, what Adam Smith is referring to is what you saw, particularly in the perfectly competitive market, right? When people, particularly business owners, acting in their own self-interest to maximize profit, end up, in the long run, being forced to produce because they can't change price, being forced to produce, in other words, because they can't raise price, they have to cut cost. And so they're forced to produce where costs per unit are lowest and resources used per unit to produce goods and services are least, meaning that society's wealth is maximized because firms in a competitive market are forced to produce where the lowest point is on their average total cost curve, right? Cost per unit curve, total cost per unit curve, right? So that means costs per unit are lowest at that point. It also means society's resources are being used most efficiently to produce at that point, which of course benefits everybody. But there's a limit. In reality, Adam Smith's theories continue to this day. Not that though they should, because, well, the world economy is not like it was 200 and whatever years ago. It's very different, and the theories were flawed to begin with. They assumed that all firms tried to maximize profit, right? And so this notion that competition will make things cheap and will make them efficient is often applied to many fields and many industries, even those that aren't competitive. For instance, politicians will try to say that we should, open up certain non-competitive fields to competition to make them more efficient, to make them cost us less, for instance, healthcare or education. But those organizations don't seek to maximize profit. So the choices they make won't be with the end of maximizing profit. They don't apply. They don't work at all. And people do this all the time. Some of the other major problems are quite simply some of these other economic notions that of externalities, right? They're not included in the cost graphs. Those costs aren't included. And they are things like, for the auto industry, externalities would be the cost of the roads that the cars have to drive on, the cost of pollution from making the cars and from burning the gasoline, the cost of all the ambulances and police patrolling the roads, of legislating laws to govern how you drive. All those things cost money too. They're ultimately the cost of automobiles, but they're not in the price tag of an automobile or the manufacturing cost of an automobile. That's an externality, right? Second, efficiency and scale isn't always possible. There's no such thing as a competitive industry for nuclear power plants. Like, you can't build one on a small scale. Same thing with automobile manufacturing, right? It's not possible to have a perfectly competitive or anything even close to that theoretical example of a perfectly competitive auto industry. Not possible, right? Second, you have issues with technology. Technology is what improves productivity and thus our standard of living, at least in a modern, advanced economy like ours. But in a competitive industry, you don't have the money or the profits to divert to research and development. And second, because one of the characteristics of perfect competition is that all information is shared, you have identical products, you can't keep secrets, there's no reason for you to spend your money to invent new technology, because as soon as you do, everybody's going to steal it. And then on the other hand, another problem with the theory, the organizations that, the companies or firms that do have the resources, like monopolies, to do the research and development, why would they? Why would they spend the money when they're a monopoly and they ain't making lots of profit already? Why waste money, right? Because that eats into your profit. So that there's some weaknesses there in the theory, right? It's false. It doesn't work like that. So a lot of people rely on these theories pretty heavily, but they're not perfect. They're just sort of frameworks, right? Again, we already talked about all firms are not profit-seeking. Last point, similar to the second, that the cost structures, as we even did an example, right, where we just put the perfectly competitive demand marginal revenue line right onto the monopoly graph. That assumes that cost structures are going to be the same and costs are going to behave in the same way for big firms versus small firms, for competitive firms versus non-competitive firms. That's hogwash, garbage. Of course it's not going to work like that. Do you think General Motors cost structure is the same as, you know, the Hasty Market on the corner of your street? No. So, I mean, they're different industries, but even if they were the same, the cost structure simply would not be the same. Your fixed costs would be different. You wouldn't have the same clout with your suppliers, so your variable cost line would behave differently. You wouldn't get the same deals. You wouldn't get the same sort of buy in bulk, get a deal kind of thing. You wouldn't get that same offer. So your cost structure will be totally different in firms of different size. So, in a nutshell, that's firm theory, and that's the big picture, in addition to what you learned about while doing the exercises.